Hi everyone, this is Osler Ortez, a state corn extensionist at Ohio State. We are here today in the Worcester campus. We are standing in our Battle of the Belt plots. We have corn planted on your right side of the screen. We have soybeans planted here in my opposite direction. So far, 3 planting dates. We started first date last week of March, second date middle of April, and the third planting date we got it in the ground on Monday evening, just before the showers. And that's a good side note for our topic today. We have Dr. Manbir Rakkar, and we will be discussing nitrogen management when we have surplus water or water excess conditions in the field. Manbir, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Osler. Again, as Osler mentioned, I am Dr. Rakkar, and I am an assistant professor in SENR department, and I also serve as a soil fertility specialist for Ohio State.
Excellent. So the reason why we came to this topic of nitrogen when there is surplus water is the past 2 weeks we know have been challenging in Ohio. There have been quite a bit of rain. A lot of the planting progress has been slowed down because of that. This week we have been expecting heavy rains. So far today is a sunny day. We don't have that quite, but there are still high chances for precipitation later this week hitting Worcester and across the state. So we wanted to touch base on some of the main implications for extra water in the field as it relates to nitrogen. And to get us started, Manbir, what are the implications of excess or surplus water for planting and nitrogen losses specifically in corn?
Right, great question, Osler. I think of water, it's probably the most important factor when it comes down to how much yield we're gonna get. Last year it was drought, so too little water is problematic. If it's too high in excess and surplus, that's an issue as well. And as we are seeing across Ohio, we have all sort of different implications happening to the growers at this moment. For example, to start off, there are a lot of growers that are just waiting for the fields to dry out for the field like planting operations. If the situation remains too wet, that can have implications on like delayed planting operations. There are a lot of growers that are coming to a point that they can no longer wait anymore. So they just want to get out in the field and plant for XYZ reason. Now, when you do planting in these wet conditions, it can pose a very high risk for soil compaction. Again, that has an implications for yield. If growers have done already planting and the crop is in the field, but there are consistent wet conditions, that has implications for germination, plant vigor, plant disease pressure, affecting a lot of crop physiological processes, like if there is a stagnant water, that can suffocate roots as well. And again, last but not the least, this excess water has a lot of implications of nutrient management, especially talking when we are considering nitrogen management. Nitrogen is sneaky to start with, and whenever things go abnormal, whether it's too dry or too wet, it just gets the chance to really accelerate those nitrogen losses from out of the system. So
That's an excellent overview. Thank you for all touching on all of those points, different implications that we can have for wet conditions in the spring. Now, moving a little bit closer and deeper into nitrogen, what are the main nitrogen forms that we find in the soil?
So in soil, there are two major forms. Nitrogen can be there in organic form, and the second form is inorganic form. When we talk about organic nitrogen, this is mostly present in the soil as proteins, nucleic acids kind of scenario. If we are talking about how much of organic nitrogen is in the system, a thumb rule is if for every 1% organic matter, there is about 2,000 pounds of nitrogen. Now that 2,000 pounds of nitrogen is actually not available to the plants. In general, we can count on about 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year for 1% organic matter. Majority of the nitrogen that is relevant for our plants is the inorganic form of nitrogen, and that specific nitrogen form can either come from the fertilizer applications that we do, or it can come from the organic nitrogen form through mineralization.
Excellent. Excellent. Now that we know what the main two forms are, what are the main losses that we might be experimenting or that we should be considering, regardless of excess water or non-excess water as well?
Right. As I mentioned earlier, nitrogen is very sneaky, and especially that inorganic nitrogen form. It can be present either as a ammonium form, that's a positively charged ion, or it can be present as a negatively charged ion, which is known as nitrate. Now, if we are talking about very dry conditions, that ammonium form is likely to volatilize into gaseous form. The scenario would be very high temperatures and we apply fertilizer, example urea, as a broadcast application. Right now, those are not the situations that we are facing. We are facing excess water conditions. And in that prospect, there are three main pathways that nitrogen can be lost. One, if you applied fertilizer and there was an intense rainfall event and that fertilizer was sitting on the soil, and especially if you have a field that has a slope more than 2-3%, you can expect some of that fertilizer being eroded through the soil erosion process or as a runoff getting out of the field. If you are in a situation where you don't have a whole lot of slope, it's relatively flat, then there are other two forms, that's leaching and denitrification. When we are talking about leaching, this is when that negatively charged ion nitrate that moves down the soil profile out of the rooting zone with the moving water. So excess water, if there is no plant growing, that nitrogen, that nitrate that is sitting in the soil, it just binds with that water and moves out of the system. Reason being that nitrate is negatively charged, soil particles are negatively charged, so they don't hold each other together. If it is sitting in the system, it's going to flush out if plants aren't uptaking that. Leaching losses are more prominent when, first, if your fertilizer type has a lot of nitrate, for example, urea versus UAN. Since UAN has 25% nitrate to start with in its form, you can expect more nitrate leaching losses compared to if you used urea. And another thing that is required for that leaching is what kind of soil type you have. If you have well-drained soils or coarse textured soils, those leaching losses can be more compared to if it's a fine textured soil. Now, if you're thinking, oh good, I just have fine textured soils, I'm good with the nitrogen losses, unfortunately that's not the case. Again, nitrogen is very sneaky. It has another pathway to get lost, and that is known as denitrification. In that scenario, what happens is that nitrate forms, gets converted into some sort of nitrogen gas. It could be nitrous oxide or all the way to nitrogen gas, especially when it is saturated water conditions or waterlogged conditions. Again, how much denitrification loss could happen? Again, that's going to depend on what kind of soil type you have. Fine textured soils, much more likely to have denitrification losses compared to a coarse textured soils. And then secondly, the temperature and duration of that waterlogging conditions makes a difference. Right now, our soil temperatures across Ohio are hovering somewhere around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have a waterlogging conditions for about 3 days consistently, you can expect about 10% loss of nitrogen. Things go really bad when the temperatures go up like 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Luckily, we don't have those soil temperatures at the moment, so we are safe in that context.
Excellent, excellent. Um, the follow-up, now that you explained all these pathways for losses of nitrogen, what are some of the strategies that we can use to mitigate some of those losses? And you kind of mentioned some of those.
Right. I think the most critical part of nitrogen management is to really try to synchronize that nitrogen supply with the nitrogen demand. And this can be achieved by various methods. And I'm going to just point out 4 R's of nutrient management that we usually talk about in soil fertility. Timing of nitrogen application is very critical. Now, just as an example, for at least the corn, majority of the nitrogen demand is when the plant hits around V4 to V6 stage and then up to the reproductive stage. But before that stage, there is very small fraction of nitrogen that plants really take up, only about 20 to 30 pounds. So if possible, we can go for split application. Supply only a fraction of nitrogen at pre-planting situation or with planting, and then wait up until V4 when plants really need that, and then apply that rest of the nitrogen as a side dress application. So that would count as a right timing, right? You can go for right source if you don't have the capability of doing split application, and if you're expecting that there's a huge gap between when you apply fertilizer and when the plant's really gonna need it, you might want to invest in some kind of nitrate inhibitors, especially if you are expecting that your field is susceptible to a lot of nitrogen losses. So that could be one of the strategies with respect to the right source. And then, of course, the placement part is important. If you can do side dressing 2x2, that's the greatest way to do it rather than broadcasting any fertilizer. And then ultimately, the right rate is always critical. You don't want to put a lot of nitrogen into your system. That is much more likely to get lost compared to if you have more conservative nitrogen approach.
Wonderful. The 4 R's, right placement, timing, source, and rate. That's something that we learned back in college. And when it comes into practical applications, we really have clear pathways to put those into practice and prevent some of the nitrogen losses. So it's great to see that coming into practice here. Being that said, what are some tools or resources that you will recommend our viewers when it comes to nitrogen management?
Yeah, so for all kind of nutrient management decisions, the one-stop shop for at least Ohio is the Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations. A lot of efforts have gone into preparing that document, so I really recommend referring to Tri-State Fertilizer Recommendations for any kind of nutrient management, and that includes nitrogen. For specifically nitrogen, we utilize an online tool which is known as MRTN. That can be utilized to determine the right rate, what makes economical sense in your system when it comes down to the rate question. And then when things go wrong, for example, too dry of a condition or too wet of a condition, I would highly recommend to subscribe to the corn newsletter. We post periodically articles in that newsletter that are really relevant to the current state. For example, we just published an article on how this wet conditions and nitrogen management in wheat is going to affect. And again, this wet conditions and nitrogen management for corn, that could be another topic. So just keep track of that corn newsletter and you can get really good information there as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We will make sure to put links into the article that will come along with the video so that our viewers will have access to those important resources. Um, Besides that, are there any other final thoughts that you would like to add when it comes to potentially having too wet of conditions for planting period here in the state of Ohio this year?
Right. Apart from nutrient management question, there are all other agronomic decisions that you can make. I know Osler has been working on this question of when is the right time to plant. So a lot of good data has been generated, and you can pick and choose what makes sense for you with respect to planting date from that data set. That's a great resource. Again, if you're noticing year after the year that your soils are just too wet to work with in spring situation, maybe you should be considering drainage tiles in those scenarios. If you don't want to go that far into installing a big drainage tiles into your system, I'm a big proponent of soil health. Maybe investing in those kind of principles would be a good approach. Utilizing no-tillage practices, or even having cover crops in your system that can really relieve the system to flush out either the excess water or just make the soil more capable of workability that you can get into the field even if soils are a little wet, could be another possible solution. And then other than that, breeding programs have advanced quite a lot. You can pick a variety that is much more resilient to wet conditions. Could be another option, I'd say.
Excellent. Those are very good, and we talk about those all the time. I think one of our future topics will be adjusting management decisions under delay planting scenarios. So just stay tuned, and in a couple of weeks, we will be digging a little bit deeper into that topic.
Sure,
Thank you
yes.
for your time today, and please subscribe to our core newsletter. We will continue to share research updates as this project moves along.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you
Manbir.
so much, Osler, for invitation. And again, I just want to put this thing out. If you have any other questions related to nutrient management or soil fertility in general, reach out to your extension agents in your county or just contact me, and then we can do one-on-one question answers to solve that issue. But again, thank you.
Thank you.